and welcome to the latest episode of Zag's APUSH. Today we are continuing our discussion through time period 6 and targeting the industrialists and the labor movement. So, like I said, we're continuing through period 6, and as we begin, we are going to examine the rise and the change in the means of production. This time period has seen a change in the way America does business. The regional economy, prior to the Civil War, is now going to be replaced by the national economy. And like we've talked about before, if you look at the stages of American history through the 19th century, the early stages of the 19th century, you were going to see a very localized economy. People doing subsistence living, subsistence farming, and then that's going to transition as a result of the canal boom and steam travel through a more regionalized economy. Now that the Transcontinental Railroad is completed and different spur lines are completed, you are truly going to now see a nationalized economy. And what's going to also become part of this nationalized economy is more nationalized businesses, and the work of corporations are going to change throughout the influencing of these major industrialists. So what we're going to see is the biggest factor that has led to this transition into a national economy was technological developments of post-Civil War America. This is nothing new. We've seen the rise of technology is going to make changes in our infrastructure and in the way government does business, and in the question of what is the role of government. While the Transcontinental Railroad was the tech marvel of the time period, mechanization of factories that would increase the productivity of labor and the volume of goods that were produced. The name of the game was mass production. New systems replaced old systems that were at times not effective and chaotic with the new systems that created and organized the means of production, and in turn, a more effective business practice. These systems included industries like the meatpacking industry, most notably in Chicago, the steel and oil industries from Carnegie and Rockefeller. But that's what's gonna take center stage today is the steel and oil industries, and we see the immense wealth from the two pioneers of these industries, John D. Rockefeller with his Standard Oil Company and Carnegie Steel. These two men will be the case studies on how new technology would create a revised business plan that would literally build America and their individual wealth. But with these great powers comes great responsibilities, and we look at the backlash of these ruthless business practices on the labor force. So that's going to be another part of our discussion today, is looking at these men and really trying to think about, are they robber barons or are they captains of industry? And a robber baron is somebody that is with unfair practices, and justification is more really for their own benefit and not really benefiting society. Whereas a captain of industry is creating a product and distributing their wealth to benefit society. So let's take a look at our first case study. We're going to look at John D. Rockefeller, and what we're looking at with Rockefeller and Carnegie is really how their business practices have changed and how they are going to corner the market. And what we're looking at here is our first with Rockefeller is that Rockefeller hated ineffectiveness. And what we need to know with both of these men, and really a lot of these industrials at the time period, is they don't invent these products. Carnegie didn't invent steel production. Rockefeller does not invent refining and kerosene production. But what they do is, and what makes them so ingenious, is that they change the effectiveness of it. They make it more effective. They make it more practical. They make it more useful to society. Hence the argument of there being captains of industry. So Rockefeller was in the oil business, and he did not drill for oil, okay? Rockefeller comes from humble beginnings. We'll make that argument. He comes from humble beginnings, but he is educated. He does fit into that mold of the vision of America, of white and Protestant. And what we see with Rockefeller is that his father was a lousy guy, and that character trait of his father being a lousy guy and Rockefeller really having to help his family and that work ethic to help his siblings and his mother is going to resonate with him throughout his entire life. And that's going to be a major driving force behind his his business practices. So he's not in the oil drilling business. He's not an oil speculator by any means. He feels that that's gambling, and he does not want to be involved in that. What he does is he effectively creates the oil refining business, and what he's going to do is now use his knowledge and use different business practices to refine oil into kerosene. And kerosene is going to be a new technology really for lighting and heating. And as the nation is moving away from whale oil, and most of the nation, electricity is in its infancy by like the 1890s, but the United States is going to be really relying on kerosene during this time period. He's going to change the way that a business is modeled. Again, prior to this, it was very chaotic. It was very ineffective. And he's going to use horizontal integration to create and amass his wealth. And what horizontal integration is that he is going to buy different areas, buy different refineries, so to speak, buy smaller companies, smaller refineries under the Standard Oil umbrella, and he's going to buy out these companies. He's going to be able to corner the market. And going back to what his big mission statement is of effectiveness, this makes sense to him. He's going to consolidate these companies, and he's going to then be able to sell his 2-gallon can, this new tin can of Standard Oil. And it's called Standard Oil because everything was going to be the standard. He's going to set the standard for the oil industry. So that's what we see with Rockefeller. Again, oil tycoon, refining oil, creating a standard product, and creating a horizontal integration where he is going to buy out the smaller. He's going to buy out his competition. That's what he's going to buy out the smaller oil producers in the nation. And he's going to make his fortune by doing ruthless tactics as well. He's going to put the screws to the railroads in the sense of he's going to pressure the railroads into different types of rebates to make sure that his product is getting preference on these rail lines and being able to ship his product at a more affordable rate to himself. And he's also going to, at times, circumnavigate the railroads, and he's going to create the pipeline. He's going to build an oil pipeline in the United States. Not, yes, the technological advancement of the pipeline, but also to put pressure on the railroads so that he could then effectively pull his product off the railroads. The railroads would lose money as a result of not being able to have Standard Oil on them, and then also being able to, again, amass more wealth. Now, this is having a huge benefit for the consumer in the sense of you're getting this oil product, this new piece of technology, really, that's going to make the standard of living increase and the comfort of living increase, because now you're going to have a way to light your homes and heat your homes. But on the other hand, he's amassing this wealth, and he's really doing this with these, to some extent, these ruthless tactics against other industrialists, other companies. He's going to even hurt the consumer in the sense of now he's creating a monopoly. And you're going to have your trusts, and then the trusts are different businesses within different companies within the same industry that come together and have a board of trustees to make decisions. And Rockefeller, on the other hand, is going to create one person, one individual company that's going to set the market, and that's going to be the monopoly. And what you see with his monopoly is at one point in his career, he's going to have roughly 90% of the oil production business in the United States of America. So that's a huge number for one company to have control over. So those are the big ideas with Rockefeller. Now, another person that we're going to be looking at is Carnegie. Now, whereas Rockefeller had a much more advantaged childhood, again, although his father was crummy and did some, with being the con artist and everything else. Carnegie, on the other hand, Carnegie is going to be your rags to riches immigrant group. So Carnegie, a Scottish born, comes to the United States and really has nothing. And he's going to work his way all the way up to one of the most wealthy men in America. rivaling Rockefeller. And those two are going to have a rival in of themselves. You have Rockefeller, who's a devout Baptist and doesn't, abstains from drinking alcohol. And Carnegie, during Christmas time, will send Rockefeller a, $200 bottle of scotch, and knowing that he's not going to drink it. In return, Rockefeller would send Carnegie a cutout from a brown paper bag of a vest to show about his poking fun at Carnegie's humble beginnings and poor lifestyle. But Carnegie's going to get into the steel industry. And what all these men see is the future. That's what they're foreshadowing everything here. And they're not living in the now, but they're living in the future. And what they see is this what Carnegie sees is the steel industry. Steel is going to be used for railroads and bridges and buildings, and it's going to be literally the backbone of America, of American infrastructure is going to be steel. And prior to Carnegie's steel plants, steel was expensive to use. And, it was used for small ticket consumer goods like forks and knives and cutlery and items of that nature because it was so expensive to make. So again, he doesn't invent the Bessemer process, but he adapts this new Bessemer process into his factories, into his plants, and in high heating these steel alloys and different alloys to come in and create steel, which is going to be lighter and stronger than iron. And he's going to utilize, in his corporate structure, he's going to utilize vertical integration. Now, where we talked about with Rockefeller, horizontal integration of buying up all the small companies and gaining the advantage in the industry that way. Vertical integration, on the other hand, which Carnegie is going to adopt, is going to be owning all means of production and transportation of a good. So Carnegie is owning everything under his umbrella, everything from the from the mine that's extracting the ore from the earth to the means of transporting that ore to a processing facility, and then eventually to a plant, and owning the plant that's going to turn it into steel, and then owning the means of transporting those goods out of the plant into the market. And again, we're going through an economic depression in 1873 and 1893, but these two men, it is affecting them, but they're amassing enough wealth that it's not going to really hinder their production because they're not making consumer goods. They're not making items that our everyday people are purchasing, such as the middle class, which we're going to talk about in our next video on urbanization and immigration. But for right now, what we need to review here with Carnegie is that his big ticket item, he's in the steel industry, he's the story of the rags to riches, ideology, and he's using vertical integration. He's using he's owning all means of production. Now, ruthless tactics again. We're seeing ruthless tactics from both Carnegie and Rockefeller, and that would give an argument over them being a robber baron. But now, what's giving them the justification for this type of behavior, so to speak? Well, the justification is going to be from Herbert Spencer and is going to be adopted from social Darwinism. And Herbert Spencer is one of the first that adopts this ideology to business practices. And what he's going to say is that that the fittest person should be the one in control. That's what he's saying. It's survival of the fittest. The fittest person should be the one in control, and everything else would basically then trickle down. And that's, this is an early ideology of trickle-down economics where you're going to have advantages from the top, and eventually those advantages for the top will trickle down to the lower classes, to the workers. So you're going to go from upper-level management to the owners, and it'll trickle down all the way to the people that are on the plant floor working. A lot of times that is not the case, but Carnegie feels that this social Darwinism, that because he's the fittest person, so to speak, for this responsibility, that he's going to have a responsibility for the poor and for the underprivileged, and that's what he connects with in his writings in the Gospel of Wealth, where it's the responsibility of the rich, it's the responsibility of the privileged to really help the poor and help with philanthropy. And that's going to be a word that we're going to see pop up now during this time period is philanthropy, where they're going to donate a lot of their wealth to various groups. You're going to have Carnegie building libraries and music halls, and John D. Rockefeller is using his monies to build churches and helping with his Baptist faith in that area. So a lot of this is going to be seen like they're not just giving out money. They're just not like handing out cash to people down the street, but they're putting it as almost like a means of production. Like when society needs their help, that they're going to be there willing to help society. That's what they're going to be looking at here. So we see that with this rise of industry. To recap the rise of industry, what we see here is that America is changing. America is changing in the way that the technology is changing. That's going to be fostered by the Transcontinental Railroad really kicking this off, but then new mechanization in the factory industry with steel and oil, and we're going to see the two, Carnegie and Rockefeller being the case studies for this mechanization, for this increased technology with their two products, oil and steel, and with their two business practices of Carnegie with vertical integration and Rockefeller with horizontal integration. Part two of our discussion today will be revolving around the labor movement as a result of industrialization. The accelerating growth of industry, especially the steady mechanization of production, dramatically changed employer-employee relations and created new categories of workers. Both in turn fostered competition among workers and created conditions often hazardous to the health of workers. This is the first time in history that we're really starting to hear the words employee, and we're seeing this as wage labor. So that's a major change in the American identity, is having people go to work every day, come home, and that revolving cog in the wheel type of ideology. And Lou Masur would argue that in his book, The Sum of Our Dreams, A Concise History of the United States, which we're going to be pulling a lot of our information out of, that this is all new. This is a new idea in America, and that's changing into what we consider today. We're looking through this from a 21st century lens of what is normal, of going to work every day and earning a wage and being able to live off that wage. And during this time period, this was uncharted waters. So we talked about previously with the industrialists that their main goal is production and profit, mass production, and is making as much money as they possibly can without a lot of overhead, so to speak. So what's the best way to do that? By exploiting their workers. So because prior to this time period, there were really no labor unions like we have today. We have a ton of labor unions today that collectively bargain, I guess you could say, they collectively bargain, have collective bargain agreements, contracts, and negotiations with their employers for better working conditions, better pay, better working hours, etc. So this all started in the post-Civil War America with your first national labor union that comes about. And then what we're really going to look at today is the Knights of Labor and the Haymarket riots and the American Federation of Labor. And really, where does the government stand as a result of these worker uprisings, so to speak, against industry that's literally building and fueling America. And the United States now, what we need to think about is, as we go into this, is the United States is in a depression during the time of the industrialists. And you could say, well, how can they still be making these productions and mass producing items, but then the United States is in a depression? We were in a depression in 1873, and then 20 years later in 1893. Well, what we're seeing here, as I said previously before, is that these industrialists aren't making consumer goods. Okay, the consumer good industry is going to be coming about, especially with the rise of the middle class that's going to be enjoying consumer goods and better living conditions as a whole. But Rockefeller and Carnegie are not making consumer products. Plus, they've amassed so much wealth that if they're losing money, which obviously they don't want to do, but if they're losing money, it's not going to be that they, it's not going to get so bad where they cannot feed their family the following day like it will for the average worker. So thinking about it with profit on their mind, what is the best way for these industrialists to compensate for the loss as a result of these depressions that are going on economically? Well, the best way for them to do it is to cut worker wages. So they're going to cut worker wages, and if a worker complains about having a wage cut or having different types of environmental issues at the time period, they will be fired. They will be fired because then you have a pool of immigrants, of other unskilled laborers that would come right in and do the job. So one voice doesn't really make a difference. But what workers are going to start to see is that many voices will start to see change from the employers. That's what we're going to start to see. So let's take the Knights of Labor is going to be one of our first labor units that we're going to talk about. That was under the direction of Terence Powderly, and they are very inclusive. So they're including women, they're including African Americans, but nothing is organized within this union. Okay, this union is a massive, massive union, and at their height, their membership is going to grow to 730,000 by 1886. So they're going to have 730,000 members of this trade union, but nothing is organized. So Powderly was a victim of his own success. Being all-inclusive, meaning that all trade unions were just, there was no separation. So like today we have the teachers union, the electrical union, the iron workers union, the firefighters union, the police union. Okay, this wasn't the case under the Knights of Labor. Everything was kind of glumped together into one union. Powderly and the Knights are going to really work for workers' cooperatives to make each man his own employer. 2, they're also going to work for the abolition of child labor. And 3, the abolishing of trust and monopolies. So what we're seeing here is very aggressive approaches to this. And we're going to see like a lot of the problems in the workforce are terrible working conditions, dangerous working conditions, very limited lighting, so you can't see what you're doing. Child labor is going to be on the rise during this time period. Children as young as 7 years old are going to be working in these factories. So we're going to see a lot of this is going to be working for pushback. Now, the downfall of the Knights of Labor is going to be the Haymarket Affair. And the Haymarket Affair is where we see a group in Chicago protesting in 1886, protesting police brutality towards union workers. Now, again, the government during this time period, as H.W. Brands would say, the government is backing, basically, is supporting the employers. They're supporting industry because of the profits that they're making. So really what you're seeing is that the employer and capitalism is running the ship, and in the wake of that capitalism is democracy. So these union workers are going to really look to democratize themselves, the same ideology as what we saw during the 1820s and the 1830s of the democratization of America, that people want to get in control over their own employment, over their own lives, and fight for their rights, so do so collectively. So this Haymarket Affair is going to get violent, and we're going to see a lot of violence during this time period between the unions and the workers, between the unions and the employers that they're protesting against. So besides the strikes and the work slowdowns and other forms of protest, it's going to become violent. Now, you're also seeing a rise in anarchism during this time period and other types of radical governments. We see the rise of communism, the thought of communism, the rise of socialism going on in Europe, and that ideology, that Marxist ideology, which is really based around the worker. And that's a direct attack on American capitalism. So that's going to put the fear in the government. That's going to put the fear in the employer that these now union workers are becoming radicalized. So the Haymarket Affair is what we see is somebody throws a pipe bomb, and many people are lose their lives and are injured during this event. And we're going to read a piece now from Lou Mazur on the impact of this violent act of the Haymarket Affair. So too, the Haymarket Square bombing on May 4th, 1886. following a strike against the McCormick Reaper plant for an 8-hour workday and outdoor protests in Chicago drew 2,500 people. As police were breaking up and gathering, someone threw a dynamite bomb and the police fired into the crowd. 7 policemen died, as did several protesters. In the aftermath, anti-union sentiment spread, and 8 men were tried. These were union organizers, some of whom were self-proclaimed anarchists and socialists, and most of whom were not even at the rally. In the end, the state hanged 4 of them. No one knew who threw the bomb, but journalist John Swinton recognized that it was a godsend of the enemies of the labor movement. Unionism and anarchism became linked, and authorities licensed the suppression of radical speech and actions. There are no good anarchists, except dead anarchists, announced the St. Louis Globe Democrat. So we're going to see here with Lou Masur, and I think Lou Masur does excellent analysis in this book. And what he's arguing here is that you're going to now see there's not going to be a differentiation between unions and radical forms of government, anarchism, socialism, whatever the case may be, communism, as we move through the 20th century, which is really going to come alive in the 1920s. But these violent protests, the government is now going to be able to, or the government is now going to be is supporting these industrialists, and they're using all means necessary. Violent reaction to this is not uncommon. So now we're going to see the Haymarket Affair is really going to be the downturn for the Knights of Labor. And that's where we're going to see the growth of the American Federation of Labor, a federation. Think about it like the United States under the Articles of Confederation, individual states that are loosely aligned together. That's what the AFL is, the way the AFL is going to be organized. It's going to be loosely aligned and separate trade unions that are going to be aligned together. So let's see what Lou Masur has to say. The American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, formed in 1886, was a national organization that served as an umbrella for various craft unions that represented skilled workers. Led by Samuel Gompers, president of the Cigar Makers International Union, local in New York, the AFL expanded quickly and soon claimed 500,000 members. Unlike the Knights, the AFL had little interest in corporation and collective rights. Gompers focused on palpable gains in wages and working conditions through collective bargaining. He argued that reducing the length of the workday would allow workers to improve themselves and liberate them from the drudgery of labor. In his 1890 speech, What Does the Working Man Want?, Gompers described the cycle of wage slavery. He is nothing but a machine. He lives to work instead of working to live. Workers, he said, needed time, which brings us from the lowest conditions to the highest civilizations. Both business leaders and union organizers shared this language of evolutionary progress. Horatio Algar, who wrote popular children's books that forever associated him with the American dream of rags to riches, a la Carnegie, titled one of the volumes Struggling Upward, 1890. So we're seeing here that the AFL is a more organized trade union. It's collecting these different trade unions. They're separated, but they're all connected under one umbrella. And they're calling for what we're going to call bread and butter unionism, higher wages, better working conditions, and the 8-hour workday. Now, that being said, the violence is still going to continue. Absolutely, the violence is going to continue. And our case study for a very violent act is going to be the Homestead strike in the Carnegie plant, where there was a worker lockout, where they locked the doors on the workers, and they brought in the Pinkerton guards. So the strike that was going on, the Ford Frick who's actually Carnegie's lieutenant, so to speak, brought in Pinkertons, and it became violent. Workers were throwing rocks at the Pinkertons. Pinkertons fired back during this labor dispute. And what we're going to see is that finally the Pennsylvania State Militia had to come in to subdue the violence. And again, this is not going to be an uncommon event where the federal government or the state governments have to send in troops, federal or state militia troops, to subdue these contests. So in a nutshell, what we're seeing here is the labor unions are going to have a stigmatism to them. They're going to be connected with socialism. They're going to be connected with radical forms of government, but they're going to have a place in society during this era and even moving forward, and their legacy is going to continue to today. Now, another thing I want to touch upon to end our second part of this video and our discussion is, well, who would be a perfect ally for labor unions that's going on during this time period? I'll give you a second to think about it. That's right, the populists. Of course the populists would. Now, the populists, as we talked about in our previous video on the West, and what we have to remember is the West, the populists, the Gilded Age, it's all going on through the time period. So we're going to see a lot of connections between all these various different groups. Now, we're going to see a lot of this as well with the populist movement of the time period. The William Jennings Bryans, although he was a Democrat during the time, but he's going to foster populist ideology. Now, the populists are, again, they're fighting for the same types of things. They feel that the farmers, now the unions are collectively with the urban workers in the cities. The farmers, on the other hand, are part of the Grange movement, and part of now this populist movement are going to be, while they're different, they're the same. They're going to be fighting against the railroads. They're going to look to the government to regulate railroads, to regulate grain distribution, to regulate telecommunications, with the telegraph. So a lot of these big ticket companies, the populists are calling for government regulations, just like the unions are. The unions are now looking for this as a more governmental regulation type of institution. So why can't they be friends? Why can't they be friends? Well, the reason why they can't be friends is dating back to the Jeffersonian time period. It's the us against them. It's the cultural differences of the cities versus the agrarian rural areas. Plus, a lot of your city living and city dwellers that are working in these factories are immigrants. So they're not going to fit the vision of the white Protestant that the farmers are. A lot of these immigrants are going to be Catholic, are going to be Jewish, and you're going to see a rise in anti-Catholicism. You're going to see a rise in anti-Semitism. You're going to see a rise in xenophobia, basically, and the rise of nativism. I mean, dating back to the 1850s, you have the Know Nothing Party that is going to be your anti-immigrant party. So the cultural differences that were ingrained in the populace and dating back to the Jeffersonian time period of the agrarian versus the industry is now going to be the line down the middle that's going to not make these two, that's going to be the deciding factor of why these two groups cannot work together and create a more collective argument for their plight, because they do have the same plight. They're all looking for fairness. They're all looking for more government regulations, and they're looking for better conditions for all. They're looking for the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. That's what they're looking for. Whether it's political, socioeconomic, that notion resonates throughout the groups. This is Zag's APUSH. We'll be coming at you next with urbanization and immigration, and we're going to have a special guest for a period during our period 6 discussion and into period 7 on imperialism. So stay tuned, strive for the 5.